For most people, the story of Rome's rise feels inevitable. The legions, the discipline, the roads stretching across continents, it all seems like the natural unfolding of an empire destined to dominate the Mediterranean. But history is far less obedient than that. Empires don't rise because they're chosen. They rise because their rivals fail. And before Rome became the master of the Mediterranean, it stood in the shadow of a very different kind of superpower. A city that didn't build an empire through conquest, but through commerce. A city that didn't rely on legions, but on capital. A city that challenged Rome not with ideology, but with economics. And for a moment, it looked like it might win. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. To understand how Carthage nearly stopped Rome, you have to forget the way ancient history is usually taught. Rome is framed as the pinnacle of order and civilization, and Carthage is often reduced to a footnote, a wealthy trading power that produced one legendary general and then vanished. But that version is not only simplistic, it misses the entire point. Carthage was the first great economic rival Rome ever faced, and its power didn't come from gladiators or heroes. It came from something far more modern: trade networks, financial innovation, global supply chains, and a political elite that operated like the board of a multinational corporation. Long before Venice, long before Amsterdam, long before Wall Street, Carthage was building a commercial empire that turned the Mediterranean into its marketplace. Founded by Phoenician settlers from Tyre around 814 BCE, Carthage began as a trading outpost that grew into a powerhouse by mastering three things: the sea, commerce, and logistics. Unlike Rome, which expanded by conquering land, Carthage expanded by controlling choke points: Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, the North African coast, and eventually the mineral-rich territories of Spain. Carthage didn't need vast farmland or legions of citizen soldiers. It had harbors, shipyards, merchants, and capital. The city's double harbor, an outer one for trade and an inner circular one for the navy, was a technological marvel. At its center stood an island-shaped admiralty ringed with shipsheds, allowing Carthage to deploy or repair fleets faster than any rival. This wasn't just a port, it was an engine of economic power. Rome, by contrast, began as a landlocked agrarian society whose wealth came from farming and whose military strength came from its citizens. Its economy was simpler, slower, and far more local. In the early centuries, Rome had little interest in naval warfare or commerce-heavy expansion. It was a land empire in the making, not a maritime one. And as long as Rome stayed on land and Carthage stayed at sea, both worlds could coexist. But the Mediterranean is not a place built for coexistence. It's built for competition. Eventually, the competition erupted into what we now call the Punic Wars, 3 long, brutal conflicts between Rome and Carthage, fought over money, markets, and maritime influence. At their core, these wars weren't about culture or ideology. They were about economic systems. One side built power through land and manpower, the other through trade and capital. When 2 rising economies tried to dominate the same trade routes, conflict became a matter of arithmetic, not hatred. And everything changed when both powers reached for the same prize: Sicily. Sicily wasn't just another island. It was the gateway to maritime trade routes, a crossroads of grain supplies, and the hinge between the western and eastern Mediterranean. Control Sicily, and you control the economic arteries of the ancient world. Rome wanted security. Carthage wanted revenue. And when 2 rising powers want the same thing, war becomes less a question of ideology and more a question of timing. The First Punic War erupted not because the 2 civilizations hated each other, but because they shared the same strategic instinct. Whoever held Sicily would shape the balance of power. Carthage entered the conflict as the experienced naval hegemon, confident in its fleets and its mercenary forces. Rome entered as a complete amateur at sea. But here is where the financial story begins to diverge. Rome, recognizing its weakness, didn't hesitate to innovate. It copied a Carthaginian warship, built hundreds of replicas, and financed a naval buildup through loans and public contributions unprecedented in Roman history. Carthage relied on its established strengths. Rome created new ones. The conflict wasn't just a fight for territory. It was a clash between a commercial economic system and a militarized financial system learning how to leverage credit. To understand why Carthage was so different, you have to understand its unusual economic model. Rome fought wars with citizens. Carthage fought wars with money. The Carthaginian military was largely mercenary-based. Numidian cavalry, Iberian infantry, Balearic slingers, and Greek specialists. Carthage paid for talent, expertise, and adaptability. It treated warfare like a commercial venture, and as long as its treasury was full, the system worked remarkably well. Carthage could project power across oceans without conscripting its population or disrupting its economic base. It kept trade flowing even during conflict. Its merchants continued accumulating wealth. Its naval dominance allowed it to tax shipping and extract tribute from client cities. But every economic model has a flaw, and Carthage's flaw was structural, a reliance on capital rather than cohesion. If the money ran out, the soldiers ran away. Rome's soldiers were loyal citizens. Carthage's were contractors. Rome's strength increased with hardship. Carthage's deteriorated when payments faltered. And after its defeat in the First Punic War, Carthage went bankrupt trying to pay mercenary wages. The mercenary war that followed was one of the most brutal conflicts in ancient history, not because Carthage's enemies were powerful, but because its financial model collapsed under stress. A war born from credit ended in rebellion born from unpaid invoices. Yet Carthage did something extraordinary in response. It rebuilt its economy through innovation rather than surrender. Hamilcar Barca, father of the legendary Hannibal, pivoted Carthage's strategy towards Spain, where silver mines offered a new financial foundation. Here, Hamilcar created something unprecedented, a semi-private empire. The Barcid family operated like a sovereign corporation, using Spanish wealth to rebuild Carthage's military strength without relying on the city's fragile politics. It was corporate financing centuries before the term existed. And this is the moment when a name enters the story that even non-historians have heard, though usually stripped of all economic meaning: Hannibal. Most people know him for being one of the greatest military commanders of all time. But in this narrative, his importance isn't just military, it's financial. Hannibal was the embodiment of Carthage's economic model, an executive general commanding a multinational army, paid with Spanish silver, supplied through vast trade networks, and designed to break Rome's economy, not just its armies. His campaign became legendary not only because he crossed the Alps with elephants, but because he nearly collapsed Rome's alliances, disrupted its tax base, and threatened the financial stability of the Republic itself. Hannibal wasn't just a commander. He was Carthage's economic strategy made flesh. That's the moment Rome realized the truth. Carthage wasn't just a military rival, it was an economic one. Rome wasn't only fighting soldiers, it was fighting a commercial empire that could generate capital faster than Rome could mobilize troops. Hannibal's campaign in Italy wasn't about winning battles, it was about breaking Rome's alliances, disrupting its revenue, and shattering its economic confidence. In modern terms, Hannibal wasn't just waging war, he was waging financial attrition. And yet, Rome adapted again. It learned to borrow, it raised taxes, it nationalized land, it sold public property. Rome, under pressure, built the foundations of the financial state that would eventually dominate the Mediterranean. Carthage forced Rome to evolve, economically, institutionally, and strategically. In a sense, Carthage made Rome Rome. As the Second Punic War unfolded, the Mediterranean became a laboratory for two competing economic models. Rome and Carthage weren't simply fighting for territory. They were testing which financial system could survive prolonged, high-intensity conflict. Carthage relied on liquidity, its ability to pay, hire, and maneuver. Rome relied on solvency, its ability to mobilize, endure, and borrow. And in war, liquidity delivers early victories, but solvency wins the long game. Hannibal understood the asymmetry. He didn't march into Italy expecting to conquer Rome outright. He marched into Italy to destabilize Rome's economy, shatter its alliances, and force its dependent states to defect. If Rome's tax base collapsed, its credit base would collapse with it. And once Rome's credit collapsed, the war was over. But Carthage underestimated a principle that would later define the Roman Empire. Rome could survive losses that would destroy other states. When Hannibal annihilated tens of thousands of Roman soldiers at Cannae, Rome didn't collapse. It raised new armies. When Italian cities defected, Rome tightened its grip on its remaining territories. When tax revenues plunged, Rome borrowed from its aristocracy, who staked their personal fortunes on the survival of the Republic. It was economic patriotism at a scale Carthage could not replicate, not because Carthaginians were less loyal, but because their political and financial systems were built for trade, not for total war. Carthage had merchants, Rome had mobilization. Meanwhile, Carthage's own political elite hesitated to fully support Hannibal. The merchant oligarchy, wary of disrupting trade routes and losing commercial revenue, refused to provide him with consistent reinforcements. They evaluated the war the way a board of directors evaluates a risky investment, cautiously, distrustfully, and with an eye on the quarterly losses. Hannibal, brilliant as he was, faced a structural disadvantage. He was fighting a state united by citizenship, with an empire divided by profit centers. Rome could sustain sacrifices for decades. Carthage tried to minimize them. In a contest of attrition, that difference is fatal. Rome eventually responded with its own economic counterattack. It shifted the theater of war to Spain and North Africa, aiming to cut off Carthage's revenue sources, especially the silver mines that financed Hannibal's campaigns. Scipio Africanus, Rome's rising star, understood that Carthage didn't need to be conquered. It needed to be defunded. And when Scipio captured New Carthage in Spain, he didn't just win territory. He seized supply depots, hostages, treasury stores, and communication networks. It was an economic decapitation strike. Carthage's assets were no longer safe. Its revenue streams were compromised, and its strategic flexibility began to collapse. By the time Scipio landed in Africa, Carthage was operating at a financial deficit it could no longer conceal. It scrambled to hire new mercenaries, raise emergency funds, and negotiate support from Numidian allies who had grown weary of Carthage's wavering commitment. In the final showdown at Zama, Carthage entered the battlefield already outspent. The war had drained its treasury, splintered its alliances, and forced it into compromises that eroded its strategic autonomy. Rome's victory wasn't just a military triumph. It was the inevitable outcome of two very different approaches to economics colliding under pressure. Carthage's defeat in the Second Punic War led to decades of financial suffocation. Rome imposed indemnities so severe that they transformed Carthage from a commercial superpower into a wealthy but restricted city-state. And yet, even then, Carthage rebuilt its economy again, this time through agricultural innovation, manufacturing, and renewed trade. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Carthage was prosperous once more, so prosperous that Roman senators grew alarmed. Their fear wasn't military, it was economic. Cato the Elder supposedly ended every speech with, "Carthage must be destroyed," not because Carthage threatened Rome with armies, but because it threatened Rome with relevance. The final destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE wasn't just a war crime, it was a financial elimination, the removal of a commercial rival that refused to stay defeated. And here's where the story shifts from the ancient world to ours. The conflict between Rome and Carthage wasn't about good versus evil, civilization versus barbarism, or destiny versus decline. It was about economics, the contest between a trade empire and a territorial empire, between a system that outsourced its military power and one that embedded it into citizenship, between a state that relied on capital and a state that relied on credit. Replace the triremes with cargo ships, the silver mines with rare earth minerals, the mercenaries with private military contractors, and the parallels become uncomfortable. Look at today's geopolitical landscape. Some powers project influence through global trade networks, supply chains, infrastructure investments, and commercial leverage. Others project influence through alliances, military bases, and long-term credit capacity. Some prioritize flexible capital. Others prioritize national mobilization. Some build economic empires. Others build territorial spheres of influence. And when these models collide in trade wars, proxy conflicts, resource competition, or maritime tensions, the dynamics aren't new. They are ancient, tested, and predictable. Carthage's model resembles modern commercial powers that rely on trade routes, logistics dominance, and financial mechanisms to shape global affairs. Rome's model resembles states that fuse military identity with political unity, capable of absorbing losses through taxation, borrowing, and national cohesion. And just like then, the real question is not which system is morally better, but which system is structurally sustainable. The economic foundations of power determine the military outcomes of conflict, not the other way around. But the deeper lesson is more subtle. Carthage's failure wasn't that it relied on economics. It was that it never fused its economic engine with political solidarity. In prosperity, its system thrived. In crisis, it fractured. Rome, by contrast, turned crisis into cohesion. It built institutions that transformed financial strain into political unity. Its citizens didn't just fund the state, they felt they were the state. And history shows that when financial systems collide, the side with the stronger social contract, not the richer treasury, usually prevails. In the end, Carthage challenged Rome with pure economics. Rome responded by reinventing its own economics. And the outcome reshaped the Mediterranean, the ancient economy, and the DNA of empire itself. Carthage taught Rome the value of naval power, credit mechanisms, foreign campaigning, and economic flexibility. Rome, in defeating Carthage, absorbed its lessons. The victor became the student. The vanquished became the blueprint. And that's the uncomfortable truth. Economic systems don't just compete. They merge, evolve, and overwrite each other. Carthage lost the war, but Rome inherited its world. History doesn't repeat. But if you don't understand it, it'll crush you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to look.